Marseille Harbor occupied France, August 1943. A German dock worker reaches for what appears to be an ordinary bar of soap sitting on a crate near the waterfront. His hands are grimy from unloading supplies all morning, perfect timing for a wash. He walks to a water barrel, dunks the soap bar, and begins to lather his hands. The chemical reaction is instantaneous. The soap erupts in a violent explosion that tears through his torso and sends shrapnel into 3 nearby workers. Within seconds, the blast ignites fuel barrels stacked along the dock. Secondary explosions ripple through the supply depot as flames spread to ammunition crates. By the time German firefighters arrive, half the dock is engulfed in an inferno that will burn for 6 hours and destroy supplies meant for 3 Wehrmacht divisions. The Gestapo investigation is frantic and confused. How did explosives get into a secured military dock? Who planted them? Why did the device detonate at that specific moment? They find fragments of what appears to be soap, actual soap, with the distinctive smell of carbolic acid. But mixed with the soap residue are traces of a chemical compound they don't recognize. The explosive wasn't triggered by a timer or a fuse, it detonated on contact with water. And it had been disguised as something so mundane, so universally present in military facilities that security would never thought to search for it. Station 9 called it Explosive Soap Mark II. Resistance fighters who used it called it the Devil's Toiletry. The Germans, once they finally understood what they were facing, called it Wasserfeuer, water fire, because the very act of trying to clean yourself could trigger a deadly blast. It looked exactly like standard military-issue soap. It smelled like soap. It even felt like soap to the touch. But submerge it in water and it became a bomb that detonated in 3 to 5 seconds, just enough time for an unsuspecting victim to begin washing before the explosion killed them. But how do you create an explosive that's stable when dry, safe to handle and transport, yet detonates reliably when wet? And why would Britain weaponize something as innocuous as a bar of soap? By 1942, the Special Operations Executive faced a persistent challenge in occupied Europe, getting explosives past German security checkpoints. Standard explosive devices, no matter how cleverly disguised, had recognizable characteristics that trained searchers could identify. Weight, density, metallic components, chemical odors. German security personnel knew what to look for. Smuggling explosives into military facilities, factories, or transportation hubs was extremely difficult and dangerous. Station 9 needed to think differently. Instead of disguising explosives as something valuable that might be searched carefully, what if they disguised explosives as something so common, so mundane, so universally present that security would never examine it closely? Something that would be found in every barracks, every factory washroom, every ship's quarters, every railway station. Something that workers, soldiers, and officials handled daily without suspicion. Soap was perfect. Military facilities consumed enormous quantities of it. Soldiers needed it for personal hygiene. Factory workers used it to clean up after shifts. Dock workers, mechanics, and laborers all carried soap as a routine necessity. A bar of soap in a military context wasn't suspicious, it was expected. German security might search bags, examine tools, and investigate unusual objects, but they'd never scrutinize ordinary soap bars. The challenge was engineering an explosive compound that could be molded into a convincing soap bar, remain stable under normal handling and storage conditions, but detonate reliably when exposed to water. The explosive had to be powerful enough to cause significant damage, but stable enough that a resistance fighter could carry it in their pocket without risk of accidental detonation from sweat or humidity. It had to smell like soap, feel like soap, and even produce a slight lather initially to maintain the illusion long enough for the chemical reaction to begin. Station 9's chemists spent months developing the formula. They started with sodium, a highly reactive metal that explodes violently on contact with water. But pure sodium was too reactive. It would explode from moisture in the air, making it impossible to handle safely. They needed a compound that was stable when dry, but would react explosively when fully submerged. The solution involved binding sodium into a matrix of actual soap materials that would protect the reactive core until water penetrated the outer layer and reached the explosive center. The result was a chemical marvel, a bar that was 60% genuine soap mixed with 40% explosive compound. The soap component served three purposes. It provided authentic appearance and smell, it protected the reactive core from accidental activation, and it gave the device enough initial stability to produce a brief lather before the water reached the explosive material and triggered detonation. The delay was deliberate. 3 to 5 seconds gave the victim time to believe they were washing with ordinary soap before the blast. This is the story of how British chemists turned bathroom hygiene into a deadly weapon, and how innocent-looking soap bars became one of the most psychologically devastating sabotage tools of World War II. The explosive soap's chemistry was elegantly dangerous. The core contained a compound based on sodium mixed with potassium and lithium, all alkali metals that react violently with water. When these metals contact water, they undergo rapid oxidation, releasing hydrogen gas and enormous heat. The reaction is so violent that the hydrogen often ignites spontaneously, creating an explosion. Station 9's chemists calibrated the mixture to maximize explosive force while maintaining just enough stability for safe handling when dry. The challenge was protecting this reactive core until the moment of use. The soap matrix surrounding the explosive center was formulated from actual soap, typically a carbolic soap base that was standard in military use. This wasn't just cosmetic. The soap layer had to be thick enough and dense enough to prevent moisture penetration during storage and handling, but thin enough that water would reach the explosive core within seconds of submersion. The manufacturing process was delicate and dangerous. Station 9 established a specialized production facility with strict environmental controls, low humidity, no water sources nearby, protective equipment for workers. The explosive compound was prepared first, then carefully molded and encased in the soap matrix while both materials were in specific temperature ranges that allowed bonding without triggering the explosive reaction. Each bar required approximately 2 hours of careful production by trained chemists working in small batches to minimize risks. The appearance was perfect. Station 9 obtained molds from actual German military soap manufacturers, allowing them to replicate the exact size, shape, and embossed markings of standard-issue Wehrmacht soap. Some versions were made to match British military soap for operations where British-style supplies wouldn't seem out of place. Others resembled civilian soap brands common in occupied territories. The variety meant resistance fighters could select versions appropriate to their operational context. The smell was authentic because the soap component was genuine. Carbolic soap has a distinctive medicinal odor that was familiar to anyone in military service. This olfactory authenticity was critical. German security personnel might not visually inspect soap closely, but an unusual smell would trigger suspicion. The explosive soap smelled exactly like what it pretended to be because it was partially composed of that very material. Weight and density were carefully matched to genuine soap. Too heavy and it would feel wrong when handled. Too light and it might raise questions. Station 9 tested multiple formulations until they achieved a density identical to standard military soap bars. A German soldier or worker picking up an explosive soap bar would feel exactly what they expected. No warning that they were handling a deadly weapon. You won't believe the testing process Station 9 used to validate these devices. They couldn't test on humans, so they used anatomical models and blast pressure sensors to measure the explosive effects. A typical soap bar detonating while being held in someone's hands would cause catastrophic injuries to the hands, arms, chest, and face. The blast radius was approximately 6 to 8 feet, enough to injure multiple people if several were washing simultaneously in a communal washroom. The delay was deliberate. 3 to 5 seconds gave the victim time to believe they were washing with ordinary soap before the blast. This timing was psychologically important. If the detonation was instant, victims might survive by instinctively dropping the soap. The brief delay ensured the soap would be held firmly when it exploded, maximizing casualties. Manufacturing explosive soap in quantity was significantly more complex than producing conventional explosives. The chemical sensitivity meant production couldn't be scaled to factory levels. Each batch had to be carefully monitored and controlled. At peak production, Station 9's soap facility produced approximately 100 bars per week, a tiny fraction compared to conventional explosive production rates. Quality control was rigorous and nerve-wracking. Each finished bar had to be tested for stability, ensuring it wouldn't detonate accidentally, and for effectiveness, ensuring it would detonate reliably when exposed to water. Testing stability was straightforward. Bars were stored in controlled conditions and monitored for any signs of deterioration or spontaneous reaction. Testing effectiveness was challenging. Sample bars from each batch were subjected to water immersion tests to verify detonation timing and explosive force. Station 9 developed several variants optimized for different operational contexts. The standard military version replicated Wehrmacht soap and was intended for placement in German facilities where it would blend with legitimate supplies. The civilian commercial version resembled French or Belgian soap brands and was designed for sabotage in occupied civilian facilities where German personnel might wash. The deluxe version mimicked higher quality soap that might be found in officers' quarters or administrative buildings. These were slightly larger and targeted at eliminating higher-ranking personnel. Some versions were designed with adjustable detonation timing. By varying the thickness of the soap matrix coating, Station 9 could create bars that would detonate anywhere from 3 to 30 seconds after water contact. Longer delays were useful for scenarios where the saboteur wanted the victim to be farther from the water source before detonation, potentially causing additional damage to plumbing or facility infrastructure. Shorter delays maximized casualties to the person holding the soap. A particularly clever variant was the partial explosive soap, bars that were only partially loaded with explosive material. These would detonate with less force, but could be manufactured more quickly and distributed more widely. The reduced explosive charge meant they might not be immediately lethal, but they would cause severe injuries and, critically, create psychological terror among German personnel who realized that even minor injuries from soap meant the threat was everywhere. Packaging was carefully considered. Explosive soaps were wrapped in paper or placed in boxes identical to genuine soap packaging. Some were artificially aged. The wrapping was intentionally scuffed or water-stained to appear used. Others were left in pristine packaging to appear as newly issued supplies. The variety prevented German security from identifying specific packaging types as suspicious. Distribution to resistance networks happened through standard SOE supply channels, though with special handling protocols. The soaps were stable enough to survive parachute drops if properly packaged, though extreme care was required to prevent moisture exposure. Each shipment included detailed handling instructions, written in invisible ink or codes, explaining the detonation mechanism and safety procedures. Resistance fighters learned to keep the soaps in waterproof containers until deployment and to never handle them with wet hands. But theoretical danger meant nothing without operational validation. How did these weaponized soap bars perform when actually deployed against German forces? The first documented use of explosive soap occurred in occupied France summer 1943. A resistance cell received 6 bars disguised as standard French civilian soap. They placed them in the washroom of a factory producing aircraft components for the Luftwaffe. German supervisors and workers used the facility's communal washing stations at shift changes. On the first day after placement, 1 bar was used by a German foreman. The resulting explosion killed him instantly and severely injured 2 French workers who were washing nearby. The blast also ruptured water pipes, flooding the washroom and forcing temporary factory closure. The Gestapo investigation was baffled. They found soap fragments mixed with explosive residue, but couldn't determine how a bomb had been introduced into a secured facility that had armed guards and regular security sweeps. The investigative report noted explosive material concealed in hygiene product, but revealed German security had no protocols for checking soap or similar mundane items. The psychological impact rippled through the workforce. If soap could explode, what else might be weaponized? In Belgium, explosive soap was used in a coordinated operation targeting German military barracks. Resistance members working as cleaning staff replaced genuine soap bars with explosive versions over several days. The results were devastating. 7 explosions over a week killed 12 German soldiers and wounded over 20. The Germans evacuated the barracks and conducted exhaustive searches, finding 3 additional explosive soap bars before they could be used. But the damage to morale was severe. Soldiers became afraid to wash, hygiene standards collapsed, and the barracks had to be temporarily abandoned while security was completely overhauled. Dock facilities were particularly vulnerable. Explosive soap placed in dock workers' washrooms would detonate when workers cleaned up after shifts. The combination of explosive force, water, and often flammable materials stored near docks created opportunities for secondary damage. One incident in a Dutch port saw an explosive soap detonation ignite a fuel spill, triggering fires that destroyed a German patrol boat and damaged dock infrastructure. The Germans attributed the fire to industrial accident initially, not realizing the explosion was deliberate sabotage. Railway installations saw multiple incidents. Explosive soap placed in locomotive crew washrooms detonated when engineers or firemen cleaned up after their shifts. These attacks specifically targeted skilled personnel who were difficult to replace. The casualties from individual explosions were often single digits, but the cumulative impact on German railway operations was significant. Skilled crew members became afraid to use facilities, demanded security upgrades, and in some cases refused to work until comprehensive checks were implemented, all of which disrupted the railway schedules Germany desperately needed for military logistics. Perhaps the most psychologically effective use was in a German officers' club in Paris. High-quality, luxury explosive soap was planted in the club's facilities. When a Wehrmacht major used it, he killed him and wounded 3 other officers. The incident created panic among German officer corps in Paris. If their exclusive facilities weren't safe, nowhere was. Security was massively increased around officer areas, diverting resources from operational deployment and creating resentment among enlisted personnel who saw officers receiving protection while common soldiers remained vulnerable. Not all deployments were successful. Some explosive soap bars were discovered before use, either through security sweeps or because the disguise wasn't perfect. Several bars were captured when resistance members were arrested before they could place the devices. But even unsuccessful attempts contributed to the psychological warfare. The knowledge that the British were weaponizing soap created pervasive anxiety among German forces. Little did the Germans realize the soap attacks were just beginning to create systemic paranoia that would degrade their operational effectiveness across occupied Europe. Once the Germans understood they were facing weaponized soap, their response was characteristically thorough and ultimately counterproductive. Security directives went out across occupied territories. All soap and military facilities must be inspected before use. But how do you inspect soap? Visual examination reveals nothing. Explosive soap looks identical to genuine soap. Cutting bars open was impractical for every bar in every facility. Chemical testing was slow and required laboratory facilities unavailable at most locations. The practical result was chaos. Some German units banned soap entirely from certain facilities, requiring personnel to wash elsewhere. Others implemented absurd protocols. Soap had to be requisitioned from specific secured sources, used only under supervision, and accounted for in detailed inventory systems. The bureaucratic overhead was enormous. Facilities designated soap officers responsible for soap security, an assignment that became a humiliating joke among German troops, but consumed real personnel resources. Soldiers and workers developed paranoid behaviors. Many refused to use communal washing facilities, preferring to remain dirty rather than risk weaponized soap. Hygiene standards collapsed in some units, leading to disease outbreaks that further degraded effectiveness. German medical officers reported increasing lice, skin infections, and other hygiene-related problems directly traceable to troops' fear of washing facilities. The soap paranoia extended beyond military facilities. German personnel billeted in civilian homes became suspicious of soap provided by French, Belgian, or Dutch hosts. This suspicion poisoned already tense relationships between occupation forces and civilian populations. Some German soldiers began carrying their own soap supplies from Germany, creating a black market and supply problems. Others simply stopped washing regularly, creating morale and health issues. Security services attempted to develop detection methods. They experimented with water testing, submersing sample soap in controlled conditions to see if it exploded, but this was time-consuming and consumed the very soap being tested. They tried chemical spot tests that supposedly could identify explosive compounds, but these produced high false positive rates because many legitimate soap formulations contained chemicals that triggered the tests. Every positive result required lengthy investigation, further straining security resources. Some German units implemented soap tasters, personnel designated to test soap before general use. This practice was deeply unpopular and often involved forcing prisoners or civilian workers to test soap, which was both a war crime and often ineffective because sophisticated resistance members could plant soap selectively where Germans specifically would use it, while avoiding areas where prisoners or forced laborers washed. The psychological burden extended to German families in occupied territories. Officers' families, civilian administrators, and Gestapo personnel living in requisitioned housing all faced the same risks. German wives and children became afraid to wash. Some German families sent requests home for soap from Germany, creating personal supply chains that German authorities viewed as both security concerns and morale problems. By late 1943, German internal security reports noted that soap paranoia was affecting combat readiness. Units were spending excessive time on hygiene security rather than military training. Personnel were requesting transfers from occupation duty, partly because of fear of mundane objects like soap being weaponized. The psychological objective, making German personnel afraid of normal daily activities, was succeeding beyond Station 9's expectations. Despite its psychological effectiveness, explosive soap had significant limitations. The chemical instability that made it dangerous to enemies also created handling risks for resistance fighters. Several incidents occurred where soap bars detonated prematurely due to unexpected moisture exposure. One resistance member was killed when rain penetrated the waterproof wrapping he carried soap in. Another was injured when humidity in a storage location triggered detonation. These accidents were relatively rare, but highlighted the inherent danger of working with moisture-reactive explosives. The indiscriminate nature of the weapon raised ethical concerns within the SOE and British government. Unlike targeted weapons that killed specific enemies, explosive soap killed whoever happened to use it. This might be a German soldier, a Gestapo officer, or a civilian forced laborer working in German facilities. The lack of discrimination troubled some personnel who argued it violated principles of proportionality and distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Defenders of the program argued that workers in German military facilities were supporting the war effort and were therefore legitimate targets, and that the psychological impact justified the tactical limitations. The debate was never fully resolved, though the program continued throughout the war with some restrictions. Soap was not to be placed in purely civilian facilities or locations where casualties would likely be predominantly non-German civilians. The explosive force, while significant, was limited by the small size of soap bars. A single detonation might kill 1 to 3 people and cause localized damage, but couldn't destroy major infrastructure or equipment. The soap was effective as a psychological weapon and for eliminating individual personnel, but it wasn't suitable for strategic sabotage requiring large-scale destruction. Resistance networks had to balance using explosive soap for psychological impact versus using limited supply drops on more powerful conventional explosives for major operations. Production limitations meant explosive soap was never available in large quantities. The dangerous and time-consuming manufacturing process ensured supply never met demand from resistance networks. Many requested operations couldn't be supplied with explosive soap, and resistance cells had to prioritize which targets warranted using this scarce resource. The selectivity actually enhanced the weapon's psychological impact. The random, unpredictable nature of attacks meant Germans couldn't assume safety, even if weeks or months passed without incidents in their area. The explosive soap program ended with World War II. No similar weapons have been documented in subsequent conflicts, likely because modern security is more sophisticated and alternative explosive delivery methods are more effective. But the psychological warfare principles it demonstrated remain relevant. The concept of weaponizing mundane objects, creating pervasive fear of normal activities, and turning enemy caution into operational paralysis influenced post-war thinking about unconventional warfare. The soap attacks contributed to a broader pattern of SOE operations that forced German security to become so comprehensive and paranoid that it consumed excessive resources and degraded efficiency. When combined with other Station 9 innovations, booby-trapped briefcases, dummy explosives, poisoned supplies, the cumulative effect was a German occupation force that trusted nothing and feared everything. This psychological burden had measurable impacts on German military effectiveness in occupied territories. Post-war military analysts studied the explosive soap program as an example of creative asymmetric warfare. The innovation wasn't in explosive technology. The chemistry was relatively straightforward. The innovation was in understanding that warfare isn't just about destroying enemy assets, but about destroying enemy confidence and peace of mind. A weapon that makes soldiers afraid to maintain basic hygiene is achieving strategic effects through psychological rather than physical damage. Station 9's willingness to weaponize something as mundane as soap demonstrated the SOE's commitment to Churchill's directive to set Europe ablaze through any means necessary. The soap program exemplified the ungentlemanly warfare philosophy that characterized SOE operations. There were no sacred spaces, no assumptions about what could or couldn't be weaponized, no hesitation to exploit any vulnerability in enemy psychology or procedures. For the resistance fighters who deployed explosive soap, it represented empowerment. They couldn't match German military strength, but they could make German soldiers afraid to wash. That inversion of power, making the occupiers vulnerable in their own secured facilities, was psychologically valuable beyond the physical casualties inflicted. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, that Germans weren't invincible, and that clever innovation could overcome military disadvantage. The explosive soap program ended with World War II. No similar weapons have been documented in subsequent conflicts, likely because modern security is more sophisticated and alternative explosive delivery methods are more effective. But the psychological warfare principles it demonstrated remain relevant. The concept of weaponizing mundane objects, creating pervasive fear of normal activities, and turning enemy caution into operational paralysis influenced post-war thinking about unconventional warfare. The soap attacks contributed to a broader pattern of SOE operations that forced German security to become so comprehensive and paranoid that it consumed excessive resources and degraded efficiency. When combined with other Station 9 innovations, booby-trapped briefcases, dummy explosives, poisoned supplies, the cumulative effect was a German occupation force that trusted nothing and feared everything. This psychological burden had measurable impacts on German military effectiveness in occupied territories. Post-war military analysts studied the explosive soap program as an example of creative asymmetric warfare. The innovation wasn't in explosive technology. The chemistry was relatively straightforward. The innovation was in understanding that warfare isn't just about destroying enemy assets, but about destroying enemy confidence and peace of mind. A weapon that makes soldiers afraid to maintain basic hygiene is achieving strategic effects through psychological rather than physical damage. Station 9's willingness to weaponize something as mundane as soap demonstrated the SOE's commitment to Churchill's directive to set Europe ablaze through any means necessary. The soap program exemplified the ungentlemanly warfare philosophy that characterized SOE operations. There were no sacred spaces, no assumptions about what could or couldn't be weaponized, no hesitation to exploit any vulnerability in enemy psychology or procedures. For the resistance fighters who deployed explosive soap, it represented empowerment. They couldn't match German military strength, but they could make German soldiers afraid to wash. That inversion of power, making the occupiers vulnerable in their own secured facilities, was psychologically valuable beyond the physical casualties inflicted. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, that Germans weren't invincible, and that clever innovation could overcome military disadvantage. The explosive soap program was never the most powerful weapon SOE created, nor the most technically sophisticated, but it was perhaps the most insidiously clever, a weapon that exploited the universal human need for cleanliness and turned it into a vector for death and terror. It didn't respect the boundaries between combat and daily life, between military operations and basic hygiene, and in violating those boundaries, it created a form of psychological warfare that made every mundane act potentially lethal. These harmless-looking bars remind us that warfare's cruelty isn't always in dramatic battles or powerful explosions. Sometimes it's in making people afraid to wash their hands. Station 9's explosive soap turned soap, perhaps the most innocuous object imaginable, into a weapon that killed your enemies while they tried to clean themselves. That's not just clever engineering, that's psychological warfare at its most disturbing and effective. For more secret weapons that won World War II through ingenuity rather than firepower, subscribe to World War II Weapons now. Hit that subscribe button.